In today's market, there has been an increase in the supply of people applying for jobs versus the demand of jobs. Being really tight about your presentation of skills and what value you offer, whether it's on a resume or in a first interview, is going to help you stand out.
What are we seeing as the general trends in volume of roles that are being opened?
What we're seeing is a reduction in untested or unjustified investment roles. You're seeing a lot more companies kind of hone in on what their core offering is. And so you're seeing that if a headcount cannot be justified, that it might not be added to next year's plan.
When are the peak hiring times in the year based on your data?
I think it depends on. I would ask everyone to be on the lookout for new positions now if they're looking.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Open to Work podcast. This is a super special episode. I'm joined by friend of the podcast, Eric Guidice. Hello, Eric. Nice to see you on the pod.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. There's so much to get into today, and I guess just to introduce Eric in a little bit more detail, and he'll do that himself, but he's currently the CEO of Headcount 365, which is a workforce planning business, which many of our candidates in this ecosystem wouldn't have known about, but the concept of workforce planning is super interesting right now. We are peak in the middle of workforce planning season for 2025. And so I just thought it'd be great to bring you on and talk a bit more about that. But really importantly, you are a TA leader by trade. And so you have lived and dreamed the world of talent acquisition for almost your entire career. So there's so much to get into. We could probably talk for hours, but I'd love to start off with our classic start to these questions, to these interviews, and say, tell me about yourself.
Yeah, of course. So I am from New Jersey in the United States. I went to college in Delaware and graduated into a recruiting career that found me, let's say, and worked my way up as an IC to then be in big tech companies like Uber or Bird Scooters and led some departments within those businesses and kind of came up with this, how does a FANG company do recruiting, and built, a number of processes that I then created my first company around, which is called Unicorn Talent, where I rolled the big tech playbook out across venture capital's portfolio companies, like on behalf of the venture capital firm. So that all is now made available for anybody to download. If you go to unicorntalent.com, you'll see a bunch of assets there: a recruiting capacity demand forecast, a compensation and leveling framework, how to do an intake session, interview rubric, even a template for candidates to have a resume that I feel is one of the best to apply for a big tech or VC-based business. But after doing that for a few years, my bread and butter was bringing the recruiting and HR information back to finance teams for workforce planning or for use in financial reporting. And until today, it's always been in a spreadsheet. So you have to pull a report from the HR system. Here's how many people who left. You have to pull a report from the ATS. Here's how many people we're recruiting for. And then you send that manually to the finance team. And then hiring managers have their own disparate spreadsheets to figure out what they want, and they're trading and adding and subtracting. And so all that data informs how many people do we need, how much will it cost, what will we produce, which is essentially the core competencies of a workforce planning team. And so I made Headcount 365 to automate the flow of that data and then add a little intelligence about how it changes, how it moves, so that these workforce planning teams, these recruiting leaders, these finance leaders could have a much more reliable source of information to make a much tighter financial and workforce plan. That's where I am today.
And I think for anyone who is interested in working in the technology industry, it's worth checking out Unicorn Talent. There's lots of interesting things there, especially on like kind of how the sausage gets made and what recruiters do if you don't work within the recruiting industry. But even just things like the CV template I've used, and it's an excellent kind of one pager, especially again if you work in the tech industry. But then also if you're a recruiter out there, worth checking out these resources. There's so much there, and Eric's done a great job of kind of downloading his knowledge throughout all of his years of experience into these templates. So worth checking out. As a recruiter with the experience you have and hiring in the industries that you have, observing this market that we exist in from a job search perspective, what are some of your kind of recommendations or insights that you would give to any job seeker on the market at the moment?
I would say in today's market, especially in the US, there has been an increase in the supply of people applying for jobs versus the demand of jobs, right? Or the demand for candidates. And so being really tight about your presentation of skills and what value you offer, whether it's on a resume or in a first interview, is going to help you stand out. I also think it's a unfortunate volume game of determining what you want and finding every place that offers that and getting your name out there. And then lastly, leveraging your connections to get that first call, that first interview, because, referrals are everyone likes to work with someone that they've worked with. I think anecdotally, if I refer somebody, they're good. But from a recruiting metrics perspective, if you look at funnel conversion rates, so for these job seekers out there who are unfamiliar with how recruiters may be measured or what recruiting success looks like in the bigger picture, the recruiting funnel, so every step from application to interview to offer to hired, that funnel has conversion rates, and referred candidates convert the highest relative to inbound applicants or sourced candidates. And so there's a natural gravitation towards a referred candidate. So if you can find someone that puts their name to your success, then you have this, pre-existing bias that kind of helps you get the first call because, oh, this candidate's likely to save me time. I'll have to talk to less candidates to find a hire because, look, they're coming from this referred source. And so I always recommend that folks do what they can to network and try to get in with somebody who can recommend them and endorse them, et cetera, because that goes a long way in the application process.
Yeah, for sure. And it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy to a certain extent, but equally, most businesses will have a not preferential treatment. That's maybe too harsh of a term, but they will want to ensure that a referred candidate, especially if there is a genuine connection between the referrer and the referee, is spoken to. And so that can help get in front of that person that you have been trying to get in front of. And as I've said in some of my other podcasts, I've gone to great lengths in some of my applications in the past to ensure that I had someone, even a tenuous link, to get me into that business so that I could have the conversation that I was looking for.
Right. Yeah, totally agree.
What is a workforce plan? Let's start with that. And then when do we start this workforce plan process as a business?
So a workforce plan is the relationship of people versus production. And so for a manufacturing of widgets business, if one person makes 12 widgets a year and you have one person, but you need 36 widgets next year, you need to hire two people. And then there becomes a lot of complexity. So how long does it take for someone to learn how to make a widget is called ramp time. Or, once you get to 360 widgets, is there another person you can hire that improves the production of all of the widget makers, and therefore you need less of them? So that's an enablement or an operations role. And then once it's too hard to track how many widgets you make, you might need folks on reporting. So as your business scales, there are these workforce inputs that create what is needed out of people. And then as your team determines what to hire, they're balancing the skills of net new hires with the skills that exist in your business. And so to answer when is it happening, the execution of this process happens before a quarter, before a half, before an annual plan, or the fiscal year. But the data collection and the modification of your assumptions happens constantly.
Yeah.
And that's why you'll see sometimes roles posted that maybe lose attention or become unposted or don't move forward, or you get to an offer, but the company's still dragging their feet. It could be a number of different reasons, but it's all correlated to whether or not the business prioritizes the production that they're purchasing from that role relative to all the other roles in the business.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to call out, right? Like the workforce plan of a business, i.e., where do we need what skill when and why, is constantly changing. And it could change from week to week. And a business could go out thinking they need one thing and then realize as a result of some micro changes within the business or even macro changes in the business that they need to completely pivot that idea, which is why that role that you were in is no longer available, or they decide to close. And it's not because of you as an individual and there's nothing you could have done. The business is constantly making these dynamic decisions around why they want to invest in that role at that one time. And that's not related to your candidacy. And while it might be kind of very frustrating, that it kind of, you have to almost disassociate yourself from these business decisions that are happening every single day. But it's frustrating because it can absolutely impact on your kind of livelihood, which you want businesses to plan better, but sometimes they don't.
Right, and there's an even added complexity too for companies that are in this scaling mode that have what's called contingent workforce, or not. I don't mean that in terms of like contractors or supplemental workforce. I mean we will launch the U.S. market, and if that goes well, we will
Mm,
hire X roles. So if they decide to launch it, or they don't, or if it goes better or worse than they expect, it will influence how many roles that they have or the priority of those roles. So there's this dynamic nature of if one thing, then another, that will also impact the
mm,
roles as well. So it's a constant moving target. And I think from a candidate's perspective, what you want to be aware of is how the maturity, often correlated to the size of the company, may affect how dynamic it is. And so, there are large companies, maybe like like a large tech company, or that might have a lot of changes, but there are small tech companies that are very rigid in their in the way that they assign workforce because it's much more predictable. And
yeah.
so just having a general awareness will save you a lot of grief when you're dealing with the application process, particularly again in this market when there are a lot of candidates and fewer
Yeah.
jobs.
So Alderson James are one of the leading people and talent agencies. Since 2013, they've been responsible for over 1,000 people and talent hires, including one in a company that I used to work at. They helped me hire my head of technology TA. So I know the guys there pretty well. They've been responsible for scaling some of the most innovative companies in the UK and the EU. Also recently just launched in the US. So even folks in your neck of the woods now, James, can get involved for contingent, retained, and executive search. And they also now do embedded through AJX. So they can do it all.
And right now we're in the middle of what I think we would call kind of annual workforce planning, i.e., most businesses around the world are sitting there and going, what do we need to do in 2025? What are the goals of our business right now? And where do we need to invest in order to achieve those goals? I can say, totally openly that our business, as of right now, is going through that process, and we'll be going through that process for the next kind of week or so. But we're getting at the final end of it. But what's your observation on like when these annual workforce plans start, and how they're being run in the background? Like who is involved? Like what is the process? How are they trying to make decisions about this workforce plan? Like what would be useful to know about the mechanics of how this annual workforce planning process works?
Yeah. So with any planning process or making a company wide forecast and plan for what you want to do next year, there are two ways to do it. You can have the top down, here's what is allowed and people must work within those constraints. And then there's a bottom up where people request what they're looking for. And then through a calibration period, you can narrow down to what's the most important. And so the process of doing a workforce plan has components that don't change. So companies are looking at what is the production of the existing team and what are our goals for the next year. And they're looking for the gaps in the production. So if you can write a certain amount of code or recruit a certain number of heads or produce a couple of, a certain number of dollars from a revenue perspective, and you have a goal that's bigger, you're looking at the work per employee to get there, and you're scaling your workforce plan relative to the production that you need. There's also a big push for efficiency. In some cases, folks are leaning towards a automated solution like an artificial intelligence. In others, folks will look at enablement roles or hiring one person instead of multiple producers. You hire one enablement person to make the producers that you have
Mm.
more productive. And so this idea that you're going to have ratio-based scaling and a certain level of production per employee is like two major components to the workforce plan.
Yeah, and I think it's important as well, and like as a reminder almost to contextualize that this is the biggest financial investment a business will make in any given year, right? Like the headcount that they hire and maintain in that business is absolutely their biggest cost. And so really a lot of moving parts are put into this in order to get this right, in order to set that business up for success, so that their revenue they get back from that cost is proportional to that investment. And so there are all these micro tweaks happening in the background to say, like, why do we need that one role when that one role could be worth two roles in another country or in another like team or whatever. And that's where these things come, like that's where things get really complicated. Because you also don't want to get too fat if you overhire one team, and that can actually reduce efficiency and productivity and output.
Yeah, I think you brought up a great point about return on investment. And I think this translates down to the candidate as well. As you're having the conversation during an interview about what you bring to the table, it's that your production or your abilities is a bigger return than the cost of your services. Mm-hmm. And so whether you're justifying a person, a tool, a producer, a supporting employee, the idea that when you're requesting that headcount, you're providing a return on investment is what helps it get approved. I think with the recent market dynamics, there's this push for efficiency. There's a push to do the most with the least. And that's further amplified by the AI boom that we're seeing here. And whether it's fully developed for your area or not, that is a consideration that a lot of leaders are considering in their workforce plan. And so proving your ROI, whether you're requesting a new headcount to be added to your team or you're interviewing for a role and you need to convince people that you're, worth the investment, that ROI focus is a big part of developing workforce plans this year.
Absolutely. I kind of say one of two things, right, depending on the persona. But if you're a candidate, you really need to demonstrate that you can solve the business problem that they are acquiring your skill sets for. And if you think about it like this quite transactional relationship, and sometimes I think we missed it by this isn't trying to come across the wrong way, but we humanize like the experience and the person, like the culture, and like there's a lot of language around how we like get your best self and stuff like that. Like, but actually we miss that this is a transaction. This is, I want to acquire you to deliver an output for our business, and you need to demonstrate to me that you can deliver that output. In the same way, when I say to a hiring manager in a business, why do you want to make this hire? Why do you want to spend, $100,000 or $50,000 on bringing in XYZ person? They would have to go through and do a really comprehensive business case if that was a software tool, right? The amount of legwork we have to go through to make sure that someone is purchasing the right software for that business. And sometimes we don't do the same level of rigor with making decisions about whether or not we want to make a hire, but we should be. And that is, I guess, the mentality that you need to be coming into it to a certain extent with as a potential new employee. You are there to solve a business problem and produce a productivity output, to use your language. And that can be really important. And where are most businesses right now? So we're recording this, essentially at the end of October, start of November. Where are most businesses in this annual workforce plan cycle?
So you have 3/4 of production behind you, which is enough data to start making your workforce plan. You're beginning the process of doing, your annual business review or your fiscal year review. And this data is what informs workforce plans and is kind of the baseline for approving or not approving things that come through for 2025. So that's kind of what's happening on the HR recruiting side, is the data and information about production and salary and promotion and recruiting capacity is all flowing into the workforce planning team now. If you're not fully in the process, there's murmurs of what's to come. For the bottoms up processes, you're probably starting to submit like, hey, this is what I'm looking for next year. Mm-hmm. And towards the end of the year will be the calibration meeting with executives to determine what makes it, what doesn't. And if you're in a top-down process, you're in the process of figuring out what is our goals for next year, what is our budget for next year, how many heads would we like to then distribute through your executive or leadership team for the purpose of them making their request within a given budget dollar. So the data should be good, the planning is beginning, and within the next 6 weeks, everyone should start to have a good idea of what 2025 is going to present to them.
Yeah, and I think to kind of add a layer to that, like if you're opening roles in Europe, you probably are already too late in getting your hires in for the start of the year. Maybe you can just about get it in over the line if you're in America, but by the time this goes out, if your business hasn't got a big chunk of its workforce plan together already, it can assume that it's going to miss that first, January starts, it's probably going to start missing, but then also ramp time going to be anywhere between 3 and 6 months. And I think the ramp time is often the piece that most businesses kind of forget, because like we have, okay, that bums in the seat, but that's actually going to generate quite a long time before you're productive as an individual, right? And that means that if you've accounted, let's take a salesperson, because it's really easy to kind of see the ROI of their activity. If you have a salesperson, if you have accounted for, you to have 10 new salespeople that year that each get $50,000 worth of sales a year, so $500,000 worth of new sales, they're not only going to start selling at full ramp by, let's say, June, right? 6 months, if like in most businesses, but hopefully it's 3. And so you're already eating away at that ramp time, which can mean that come when you really like most. So if you're in a business right now and you're on a recruiting team, you're probably already getting like nervous energy from hiring leaders who are saying, I need my salespeople, I need people starting in January. Like, what is happening yet? And we're sitting there in recruiting going, we don't have a requisition. We can't start hiring a role yet because we don't actually know what we're hiring for yet. We haven't got sign off from the executive. We are delighted to be sponsored by Metaview. Metaview is the AI assistant for the interview process. Their AI records and transcribes hiring conversations like interviews, intakes, and debriefs, and then provides a perfectly summarized note of everything that was discussed. That means that you can focus on creating human connections with candidates during calls and save time on the busy work of cleaning up notes after every interview. I've spoken to so many recruiters and recruiting leaders who are loving using Metaview across their organizations. It's saving them time, but it also means that they have more data to make better decisions. So for every candidate and every pipeline, hiring teams can now make confident and informed decisions, and recruiters can finally take control of the interview process. The impact on candidate experience is also massive. Since recruiters don't have to worry about taking notes in the moment, they can really focus on being present and engaged with you. Forward-thinking recruiters at high-performing organizations like Brex, HelloFresh, and Quora are all leveling up their interviews with Metaview. So head on over to metaview.ai/open to work to get started for free on your first 5 calls. So maybe let's dig in. Like, what is the process from your experience, and you've worked in many different businesses, of actually creating a new role in a business?
Yeah, I mean, you actually brought it's like you're selling Headcount 365 for me. So our system for every
I haven't
role,
demoed the product. I've seen high level versions, but I promise I'm just talking through pain here.
No, I think, tracking the notice period is a difficult task. It's a manual task for most businesses. So knowing how long it takes someone to quit and then start a new job is a difficult thing to track. And you have to really be looking for it. And it's not necessarily automatically pushed into the workforce plan. And so our system is like, it does that by tracking the offer accepted period to the start date time between your ATS where the offer is made and the HRIS when they're starting. And so we can deliver, whether it's, a salesperson that all is the same level, that example makes sense. But the sales executive who's going to run that team might even have a longer notice period given the exit that they have to have from their current company, plus the notice, plus the ramp time. And so
all these things will vary by region.
Right.
Massively.
They vary by region. They vary by job level. They vary by industry. And so having data about how long it takes to have someone actually get to full production is the data that is difficult to track in spreadsheets and a large reason why we made Headcount 365. Now, onto the question about opening a requisition. When you're outside of the annual planning process, there's some level of job approvals. The most common is a backfill, or the easiest to get approved is a backfill. There is exiting salary in production, and I would like to replace it. And you will backfill that role, usually with some level of the same information from the previous role. And that's just you confirming with the business that that position within the broader org chart is still a valued position to create whatever production they have and cost whatever they have, right? And during a backfill, folks might push to automate that role with a software. They might try to offshore that role somewhere else, or try to adjust whether or not that, senior leader, I actually would like 3 producers instead of having this one senior leader. I don't need it. So you can have these adjustment periods there. And so when you're making that request, that justification as to why is a large part of opening a requisition.
And again, it's like why it can also change dynamically, because they can be introduced to a new concept or a new way of achieving that outcome, and they might deny, or kind of be alerted to like an internal change in strategy, which can change whether or not that requisition is still what they're looking for. And once that requisition, I guess, is improved, it's then passed to the recruiter who gets it live on the applicant tracking system, and then we start the process. Sometimes as well, I'm sure you'll have experienced this, there's this kind of disconnect where the hiring manager is ready, but then they haven't necessarily got all the right approvals in place. But then sometimes the job is live, and it sort of depends on like the structure and maturity of your business around like when these sorts of sequences take place. So again, like that'll be the feeling that you have on the candidate side, which is like, well, I'm waiting. I've gone through the interview process, and I'm waiting for like the approvals to happen, and that could take a while. Like if whenever I hear this from a candidate, I'm like, well, that could take 2 weeks depending on the size of your business. I've been in businesses where it's taken more than that, and it's been very frustrating.
Yeah, a very common approval process is the offer approval in the applicant tracking system. So I would like to make this offer, and I need someone to say yes before I can formally give this person a letter. And that might be what the candidates are experiencing, is the delay between this role, which is on the plan. Can I please have it? I've interviewed, I've earned it. Can you please get that? Especially when it's in the budgeted range. So that could be a very frustrating task. And I always encourage our customers to track the offer approval time so that you can see, especially if there's, a offer accept impact to having long approval time. So that might impact it there. So on the candidate side, I understand that. Headcount 365, they have, within this software, we track adding a new requisition to the plan's approval time, and we can track it again by any parameter. So we can tell how long does it take to get a backfill approved to go into the ATS? How long does it take for a new requisition that already exists in the company's HRIS system? So for example, if you're a small company with just a leader of sales and inside sales reps, you want to add one more sales rep than you've previously had. All that information exists, and that approval time is a different approval time than, let's say, you want to hire your first sales operations person, and that job has never existed in the business before. So I need to know, what level is it? What comp are we going to do? What's the profile? What is the job responsibilities? How do I interview that person? What's the process? Who's on the panel to determine what is an offer look like, right? So when a net new role gets added to the business, it's a whole other process. Yeah. And so these different approval times, again, they inform your workforce plan, but ultimately might create different levels of pain for folks who have, if I'm a hiring manager and I want to know where the status of my role is, in most companies, it's, I send an email. I shot you a Slack. It's in a Jira ticket. It's on a Google form. I have no idea, right? In Headcount 365, we show every process, every step in the process for the approval, and you could track as it goes through, exactly who's waiting. There's an activity feed. If it gets pushed back, then you can see like, this is the reason. And so hiring managers now don't have that black box of where's my role, but they get to see all of that transparency. And when you're a finance person, you're making that approval, you now have access to all the financial data to say, is it on budget or above budget or neutral? And you can make it all in one system versus a Google form or a Slack or a spreadsheet, right? So we alleviate those pains for folks trying to add requisitions to the plan.
But I guess to finish this off, based on your data, how has hiring volume changed in the past couple of years? If we say from 2022 to now, I presume you can see the macro impacts of headcount planning in your system. What are we seeing as the general trends in volume of roles that are being opened?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is a reduction in untested or unjustified investment roles. So roles that keep the business going or produce the revenue, produce the code, produce the XYZ for a business.
Product managers, like business development, sales, like they're all continuing to get investment.
Yeah. I would say that it's less the type of position. It's just the function to the business. Are you keeping the lights on? Are you growing something? Or is this an investment into something brand new or a test? You're seeing a lot more companies kind of hone in on what their core offering is and eliminate some of these roles that are either, investment or speculative, launches of product or launches of location, so that there's just a much more, everyone has to focus on a profitability or keeping their their business tight from an investment perspective. And so you're seeing that if a headcount cannot be justified, that it might not be added to next year's plan.
And based on what the kind of data is that you see, and I imagine this will be consistent with what we see across the general public market, but when are the peak hiring times in the year based on your data?
I think it depends on industries. There's a lot of seasonal businesses who plan for the holidays if you're a retail business or for a launch of a new product. So there'll be some seasonality to businesses. There's always a summer lull in at least the US, but at this stage of the year, people are trying to sneak everything they can in before the next plan kicks off, and they may either lose or forfeit their roles. And then the beginning of the year is always the rush to get everyone in. So I think we're headed into 2 quarters of, pretty nice hiring growth. And I would ask everyone to be on the lookout for new positions now if they're looking.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good sentiment to finish on. Like, one of the kind of good leading indicators, and I'm sure you see this as well, is the number of people who are in my network who are recruiters who are in roles. And if you'd asked me this question a year ago, I would have said it's pretty dire. There are not, most of my friends were out of work, like lots of people were still looking, like there weren't that many roles available, like interviewing would only happen like once in every so while. And now almost all of my colleagues are in work. There's a small handful that aren't, but it's definitely in the minority now, which is super exciting. I see more recruiting leadership roles posted every day, but also recruiting IC roles are definitely being kind of built at the moment. I can see them becoming more popular every single day as well. And if recruiting is busy, and if there's lots of recruiting roles available, that means that is going to have a trickle-down effect, because that means that they're being brought in to produce the output of more people to get jobs, right? And so there's always a good market to keep an eye on and to keep your eye close to. And I feel like I'm coming into this year, end of this year, much more positive than I was at the end of last year when I look at kind of the opportunities for people out there. Okay. Last question. I'm going to get political for your last question. This is going out. This is being recorded before the election. What do you think the impact will be on job availability based on the different candidates we have in the US for president?
It's a great question. I don't know if I have a strong opinion on who will create more jobs or motivate people to get rid of jobs. But for the next quarter or so, we're probably in the clear as the election happens and then they come into office. I don't think we'll see the effects until that new candidate is in office for a couple months and start pulling the strings on economic policy. Yeah. So TBD.
And that's exactly what I thought you would say. And I think a lot of people say, oh, well, we'll see different types of job availability based on XYZ person getting into office. And I kind of, my response to them is maybe, but the reality is that these businesses need to succeed no matter what president is sitting in that chair. And that's the same in the UK. And yes, the budgets do influence these things. But if you're like a growing business, you have to grow no matter what. And your investors are expecting a return no matter what. And they will be planning this year based on what the information is they have right now. And they're going to have to make investments and bets regardless. So to your point, we'll continue to see the same level of hiring all the way through until March, unless something happens that completely shifts the markets as a result of this, someone getting into office that potentially the markets don't agree with. Like that could shift things slightly, but at the moment, I think it's unlikely that we'll see macro shifts based on the outcome of the election.
Right. I would say we have a unfortunate deficit problem that might have to influence economic policy, and then we're going to see what AI does to GDP. Like, is this what everyone thought it was going to be, and will we see kind of that boom at least in the U.S. that we thought we would? And so I think there's just bigger things than which person holds the top seat that will influence what the broader jobs market looks like. But I would say we're fine for the next 2 quarters.
And let's round up there. So like, the message takeaway from this is that things are at the end of this year looking more positive than they were a year ago. We're going into like a potentially steady stream of positive kind of workforce growth, with more recruiters getting roles and then potentially businesses releasing their headcount plan at the end of this year, either winding down their headcount plan at the end of this year, which means potentially releasing roles, and then starting the headcount plan in January. And so the next kind of 6 months, if you are kind of active right now, like, are going to be the most critical 6 months potentially of your search. And we don't know quite what it's going to look like after that, obviously, but now is a really good time to be investing in your job search, to be putting that time aside, and hopefully, this becomes less relevant for you in a couple of months' time.
Yes, hopefully.
Fantastic. Well, Eric, where can people find you if they want to learn a bit more?
Yeah, follow me on LinkedIn. I'm always trying to post information for everybody, whether you're a candidate or a recruiter, recruiting leader, finance leader. I try to do one big blog post a week that covers topics like we covered here, and then just some daily thoughts. And that's the best place to get me directly. Headcount365.com. Check us out for if you're in the workforce planning or the headcount FP&A or recruiting leadership business. And if you're interested as a recruiter on the tools it took for me to get to where I am, that's unicorntalent.com. And we'll be launching a Slack community for that next year that will center around support of the tools that are downloadable on that site for free. So in those 3 places is where I'll be. Looking forward to getting some connections and meeting everybody live. But thank you so much for having me on the podcast. This was awesome.
No, my pleasure. And, award for best plug throughout the podcast goes to Eric here as well. So, I think you could have relied on a New Jersey American to do that really successfully. And to those of us, listening, obviously we're coming here every single week and we want to try and provide you with advice that's going to help you navigate this kind of really challenging job market that we're in still. And so, hopefully this has helped kind of demystify some of the kind of processes that are happening behind the scene and also help position you as kind of a business oriented kind of candidate in this challenging market. So taking those kind of points around ROI and demonstrating that ROI and that you can be a profitable kind of outcome to that business is really critical to a lot of the sentiment that's here. And then also, if you want to kind of get deeper into this, we have our community, which is the Open to Work community. It's www.opentowork.community. We can get access directly to us as job search advisors. We've got an amazing group there, as well as weekly events and just additional content. Ask us anything. Like, there's so much there. So please check it out. And we'll come to you next week with some more job search advice. So Eric, thanks so much for your time today. Really, really interesting stuff. And I'm sure I'll see you soon.
Yes, sir. Have a good rest of your day.
Ooh, there we go. Cool. It's threw
okay.
a curveball at the end there.